First of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here, listening to everything. It's very interesting to see how systems can be very different around the world and at the same time very similar. To the quote, or to the comment from the very distinguished national scientist back there, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. I've really enjoyed the openness of the discussion here. It's not something that happens with U.S. regulatory agencies, which I meet with very much. And if there's something to be embarrassed about at that level, certainly, we have a government shutdown, and if you follow Twitter, there's a lot to be embarrassed about. So, I'm going to talk about, I have an easier job, and to Dr. McLean's comment, I could probably skip the first 5 or 6 slides because they've already been covered. So I will go through them rather quickly, but I'm going to focus on the U.S. and Canadian systems. And the reason I say that I have an easier job is from the beginning they really haven't assessed stacks. And so you'll see in that part of the presentation that there's not a whole lot to talk about. But why have they done that? And it's not working. So I think some of this has already been covered. We're really going to focus on stacks product. I'm sorry, you're way too. Yeah, stack products produced or the product of conventional breeding, and that is really the combination through conventional breeding of 2 transformed events that, for the most part, have been already approved, and resulting in a breeding stack of those combined traits that are approved. And the resulting product is not a new transformation, and I think that's something really important to always keep in mind. We're not producing a new product. The inserted genes do not change, they stay at the same loci. The product or the safety of the expressed products really does not change either. Those were assessed during the assessment of the single products that were already approved. And this combination doesn't really impact the plant because, as already been stated by a few, during the breeding process, while we're introgressing these genes into our germplasms, anything that does impact a plant, we will not move forward. People talk about silencing of genes or interactions that cause silencing, for example. Silencing, for example, and we would be remiss and probably crucified by our customers if we sell them a product that does not conform to their needs. So if we have a herbicide-tolerant gene that is somehow in a stack silenced, and then that farmer goes and sprays that herbicide and all of their fields die, all of those plants in their field die, obviously the problem is ours, and that wouldn't ever get to a regulatory agency. I would certainly hope not. Oops. There we go. So this was already shown, and I think the importance of stacks and the growth of stacked products around the world was already adequately addressed. One thing I will add, though, around breeding is that breeding has been around for millennia, and as was said, it has produced various products that have, through selection, have led to desired phenotypes that have resulted in never really unsafe products. All of these, being derived from wild mustard, are commonly consumed. There's no novel allergen produced here. There's no novel toxin ever produced here. And it is a matter of opinion, but at least in mine, I personally would have never produced Brussels sprouts because I hate them. But aside from that, they're not unsafe. So there's really no, breeding in general does have a history of safe use. And this was something that was considered really early on when I'm going backwards again. And this was something that was considered really early on when people were thinking about how are we going to regulate GM products. And the World Health Organization basically said in early '95 that if you did produce a new variety from stacking of 2 events or 2 plants that you had proven were substantially equivalent, that event, that new variety, which is the stack, should be substantially equivalent to those parents. So that was an early on basis of why there is no real need to assess further the stack products. The other thing that, I swear, I'll get this by the end of it probably. The other thing that's important to consider is a lot of people here mention the Cartagena Protocol. The US is not part of that, but that along with the OECD really don't specifically address breeding stacks, but they do in a way exclude it. As one of their definitions that's included in both documents is really that these do not include the techniques of conventional breeding. So conventional breeding per se has had a very long history of safe use, used for millennia, and even if you think about it, if you were to do some of the assessments that we do nowadays, we could not have modern corn. Because if your conventional comparator would have been DOST-STII back in the day, you would have had a really short bushy plant that gave you a few hard kernels compared to something that's tall, gives you one corn husk and much better corn. So within those lines, these are the things that have really been considered both in the position of CLI. And so these are the things that CropLife International, and especially the team I'm working on, which is the Stack Product Core team, we consider in our own position document. And this is that conventional breeding has a long history of safe use, and is the same process applied both to the generation of many plants as well as GM plants. So it is just one more gene in the pool of genes that are being combined and being selected for. Additionally, because of this, really further regulatory assessment of breeding stacks is rarely justified. And that's because there really is no plausible risk that one could fathom from just the combination of these traits. As long as your single products have been assessed and there is no real need for or real hypothesis for an interaction. So, not only does CLI consider this, many regulatory agencies also do. Dr. McLean talked about Australia, who has made statements around that point. Canada, which she may correct me if I'm wrong, Canada's system is based on a few things. So Canada's GM system in general considers both environmental safety, food safety, and feed safety. They do this through two agencies, CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the Plant Biosafety Office within that agency, and the Animal Feed Division within the agency. And then for the food safety, that goes through Health Canada. And when they look at stacks, or breeding stacks, Health Canada is probably the easiest one. They regulate based on a novel food. The fact is that when they're assessing the single, that's what they would consider a novel food. They do not, there is no notification requirement, nor do we notify Health Canada that we were producing a stack. The only possible exception here is that if the breeding stack exhibited new novel characteristics. And this is sometimes some of the things that most agencies tend to talk about. That new allergen, that new toxin, which really millennia of breeding have never seen, and there's no real reason to think that this would ever come about just because you've inserted one more gene in. And a gene that you've probably characterized, especially in how you've inserted it, where it was inserted, both its molecular and protein characterization, its mode of action, you know much more about that than some of the genes that you're breeding in a normal plant. CFIA, on the other hand, and this is more in terms of food, and requires a notification 60 days prior to the environmental release of a breeding stack. And here there's just a letter of notification describing the product and describing that, as it says here, there's really no automatic requirement for any data to be submitted. In terms of feed safety, there's also a notification that goes to CFIA. There are more statements that are based on data that we have in terms of novel traits, whether those are present or not. Of course, they never are. Any protein expression, if it is not similar to the parental events, and similar is a broad term, But typically we receive a response from CFIA or no objection letter from them within 60 days or less, considerably less at times. And then there is, just for clarity, and I know this is more about food and feed, but there are environmental considerations. There are crops that are cultivated in Canada, obviously, corn and soybean. For that, there will be notifications regarding the environmental release of these crops, and I won't get into a whole lot of this, but they'll include things like an environmental FIA of the stack. And there is no requirement, as I said, for Health Canada. And it is a very quick process. The latest no objection letter we received was actually received in 12 days. That was even with Christmas in between. So it's a very, very quick process, very painless process. And it really is justified or based on their concerns, the regulatory concerns or lack thereof with a stack or a breeding stack. A similar situation happens in the United States. The United States, and I'd like to spend a little time here on a side note based on a comment from someone, I don't know where she is, she's over there trying to take a picture. I'll give these out, you don't need to take pictures. But there was a comment in this morning's session around making sure that agencies do what they are supposed to do. The U.S. has this system that is designated the coordinated framework. And it is very much that kind of responsibility. So the FDA really has a role in food safety. It is similar to Health Canada, it is a novel food. They are there to ensure that it is as safe and nutritious as the food as the conventional food that existed before. The USDA ensures that the plant we're producing is not a plant pest. It's not a weed, it doesn't impact insects, it doesn't impact farm practices, some of the things that have been discussed before. The EPA has a very specific role, and they only regulate GM products that contain a PIP, a plant incorporated protectant. And so these are the famous CRY proteins, BP proteins that were talked about before. And in that case, they are actually the ones that assess the food and feed safety and the environmental safety. So one of the things that we try to do as an agency, and this is to my point as a sidebar, when you're looking for efficiency, is really parcel that out. So if I have an acute toxicity test for a protein, there's no reason that should go to the USDA. They have no say on that, except as a non-target organism. They don't have much say on compositional equivalents. They might use it, and it has sometimes been used for that. But in general, we try to parcel out data in a way that allows the agency to not have to review everything. So when you have your 7 groups, I think there were, that get the whole dossier, by law, at least in the United States, when you get that whole dossier, you by law are obligated to review the whole dossier. What we try to do, as I said before, is give the data that they need to make their assessment. And so that's sort of a sidebar. But in terms of how they regulate GM products in general, it's that. When it comes to stacks, though, and this is where I said this would go really quick, it's quite simply that in terms of food and feed processing, there is no further assessment of stacks. The FDA, the USDA, and the EPA all recognize that the assessment of the single products are sufficient and that conventional breeding is safe enough that there is no real assessment required after that. Just for transparency and clarity and transparency, the EPA does regulate the cultivation of stacks when there are novel plant incorporated protectants involved. So if I have, to make up some numbers here, CRY1 and CRY2 stacked, and that's not a product yet, the EPA will evaluate that. If I have CRY1, CRY2, and 5 herbicide tolerant traits, the EPA will not evaluate that beyond CRY1 and CRY2. The reason is because these plant incorporated protectants are pesticides, and that's really what the EPA regulates. They regulate pesticides. Therefore, the pesticides in this case are treated more like chemicals in a way.
So the data that we generate on protein expression really goes to assessing exposure to NTOs, which is only, to target organisms, which is really only relevant in cultivation. So, and I think I got us a bit ahead of time here. So in summary, that's really everything that happens. It is only in the US, again, it's only the EPA under cultivation of a novel plant incorporated protecting product that will regulate that product. So the US, very simple. If I could have done it in one slide. Finally, Australia and was already mentioned in terms of food and feed. They do not regulate. What we are seeing, and this really goes to some of Dr. Kadama's comments, and what we see as CLI on a global scale is that many countries are now looking at the history of safe use that already is established for breeding, certainly, but also the history of safe use that now comes around GMs. So GM products have been cultivated for 20 plus years. They've been safely consumed by both humans and animals for many years. They've not had an impact on the environment. They've had, there was a recent article touting the sustainability of GM compared to some other farming systems. And therefore, countries, major cultivation countries that actually want to take advantage of some of these well-known histories of safe use now are starting to consider those things in their own regulations. Brazil has something called Article 4 of Normative 5, but what that really means is that for a stack product, I can submit almost a notification letter. And it's really to say this is what we're going to cultivate, and the safety of this is based on the signal. This has been used currently, and there have been a bunch of products already approved using this system. So Brazil has now moved to a system that is much more similar than Canada. The other one that is moving towards that, and CLI helped Argentina a lot in this instance. Actually, some of these slides are taken from the material used by Argentina with their regulators, is Argentina and their wanting to increase their productivity and their efficiency in their regulatory systems, asked what can we do to make it easier. And they really assessed different systems around the world. The slide deck part of the slides that I showed here, as I said, was used. There was also the example of Japan giving to the Argentine agencies. And they've really settled on more of a notification type system for their stack products. They are moving through that, and they've reduced some of the more recent approvals have gone down significantly, whereas it took years. Now it's taking a matter of months. The same has happened for Brazil, where you're down to a few months to get a stack product approved. So around the world, the considerations of the safety of breeding, the consideration of the history of safe use of GM products, and the consideration of the assessment of the single products as the basis for any need or lack thereof of an assessment for a stack product are really driving the change in a lot of the regulatory systems, as you saw for Japan, as well as some of the major cultivation systems around the world. So in summary, really due to the assessment of the single products, the history of safe use in conventional breeding, it's CLI's position and that of many governments that stack trait products should not really be further assessed. Canada's notification process provides a rapid approvals for stack trait products with no or minimal data requirements. The U.S., especially in terms of food feed, does not further regulate any stack trait breeding stack products. And then other countries that have been looking at this and have a long history of safe use are now starting to change their own regulations, adopting again their experience to simplification of stack trait product assessment. So with that, as I said, it was quite easy. Solomon, thank you so much.